Hey Stitchers, I hope you're having a good day wherever you are in the world. I thought the topic for my video today would be about fabric. Obviously, you know, it's quite important when you're a cross-stitcher what type of fabric to use. So I thought what I would do is just talk a little bit about the different types of fabric you can stitch on. Obviously, probably more aimed at, you know, the lesser experienced stitchers among you out there. Perhaps you're new to cross-stitch and just need to get an idea of the different types of fabric you can stitch on. Then I'll talk a bit about also the type of fabrics I like to stitch on, which if you've watched most of my videos you probably already know the answer to that question. And lastly I will show you my fabric stash. Don't panic, there's not loads of fabric, but I will warn you, my long-suffering subscribers and viewers already know this, but my videos can go on for quite some time, so I expect this one will be no exception. So, fabric. Now you can obviously stitch on any type of fabric, really, freestyle cross stitch. I've seen quite a few stitchers use gingham as a fabric to stitch on, because obviously with the little squares make it quite easy to evenly stitch your crosses. But obviously when you're doing the designs and patterns that all of our stitchers like to use, you need an evenly woven fabric so that you can make sure that your pattern looks as good as it can. So just for any really new stitchers out there, I'll just do two little things that can flummox new stitchers. The first one is what we're on about when we're talking about the fabric count. So say 14 count Ada, for example. The 14 refers to the number of stitches per inch in that fabric. So if you took a ruler, well, perhaps I usually do this, if I've got fabric in my stash that I'm not quite sure what the count is, you can obviously have a posh fabric ruler, which I don't have because I'm cheap. So all I do is take out a tape measure, measure an inch of a row of holes on your fabric, and when you count how many holes there are in that inch of fabric, that's what your fabric count is. So then you'll know what size piece of fabric you need for the design you want to stitch, because obviously that alters bigger or larger depending on how big or small your fabric count is. Sometimes it's also referred to HPI, holes per inch. It gets slightly more complicated for my little brain. Sometimes with French stitchers or European stitchers, they measure their fabrics in centimetres, so I have to do a little conversion in my head when I look at their work, which is ridiculous really, considering that in the UK I was born in the metric age, but I still measure things in inches and weigh things in pounds and ounces, so that obviously really didn't work. But anyway, so that's fabric count. That's what we're talking about, stitchers are talking about when they refer to 14 count, 28 count, 36 count. It's how many stitches per inch you can get in a row on your fabric. The other thing that sometimes is confused as new stitchers is the actual cuts of fabric you can buy. Quite often, the majority of designs, with the exception of Heaven and Earth designs and chatelaines and a few others, but generally most designs you can stitch on a fat quarter of fabric, and so charts will often say, oh, you know, you just need a fat quarter or a fat eighth of fabric, and some stitchers don't know what that means. So just briefly, I'm sure most of you, all of you probably know this, but just for that one person out there who might not, just as a demonstration, if you imagine that this piece of A4 fabric is a metre of fabric, what happens is for fat quarters they take a metre of fabric off the bolt of fabric, which is obviously can only be of a certain width. Off the top of my head I can't remember for the life of me now what the width is on a bolt of cross-stitch fabric. Must be, I can't think of it off the top of my head. I should know, I've got enough metres of fabric in my stash, but anyway. So it can only be of a certain width. So basically what they do, take off a metre of the fabric and fold it into quarters and cut along those lines, because obviously you can cut a metre into quarters, well, in several ways, but you could end up with thin quarters like that, which you can't really, you know, stitch a vast amount on, but a fat quarter is much more useful. So that is a fat quarter for demonstration purposes. If this is the metre of fabric, that's how a fat quarter is cut. And then of course you get a fat eighth, which is half of that again, and then you get a fat 16th, which is half of that again. And that's usually how fabrics, cross-stitching fabrics, pre-cut pieces are sold, especially with hand-dyed fabrics. That's where you get your 9x12 cuts, your 18x13 inch cuts, and then your fat quarter is usually either 18 by 26 inches or 19 by 27 inches, you know, it varies by an inch or so. But that's what a fat quarter is. Obviously, if you're a quilter, fat quarters are a different measurement, because obviously the bolts of fabric are narrower, so that means your fat quarter size would be narrower. But anyway, that's going to confuse the issue. So there you go, that's what a fat quarter is. It's literally a quarter, a fat version of a quarter out of a metre of fabric. So, onto fabrics. I would say that in my personally, in my fabric stash, 90% of the fabrics that I use are Zweigart based fabrics. The reason for that is, personally, I just find them to be the best quality fabrics out there. They're consistent in their quality and you can totally rely on them. I've never ever had a bad batch of Zweigart fabric, and I think there's a very good reason why the majority of hand dyers out there use Zweigart based fabrics as their base fabric for their dyeing, because they can totally rely upon the quality of it. And well, you know that fabrics are Zweigart based fabrics because of the names that they give them, like Brittany, and their linens are named, so you know if somebody says Belfast linen that they're stitching on a Zweigart fabric. But the other way that you can tell is on the selvage edge of the fabric. If you happen to have a piece with some selvage, they've got an orange line going through them, so that's how you know it's a Zweigart fabric. The other fabrics that make up my stash are Jobelan. Obviously that's a really popular fabric. It's not a Zweigart fabric, but it's a fabric that a lot of us use. Fantastic fabric. And just a tiny little amount in my stash is Witch Out or Permin linen, both the same. They're known as different things depending on where you live. I can't remember what, I think they're Permin here and Witch Out in America. I can't remember. Anyway, you know what I mean. So I've got a bit of their linen that I've stitched on in the past. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it, perfectly fine linen, but I just find it a bit stiffer to use than say Belfast or Edinburgh linen that Zweigart makes. So, you know, that's just a personal thing for me. I think a lot more of you stitchers in the States and Canada might possibly use that linen a bit more than the Zweigart linens. I don't know really, it's all personal taste. What you want your finished piece to look like in the end that matters. That's the important bit when you're talking about choosing fabrics. So to my mind, when I think of cross-stitching fabrics, in my mind I sort of break them down into three areas. So you've got your block weave fabrics, your cotton mix and 100% cotton even weave fabrics, and then you've got your linen even weave fabrics. Linen's still an even weave, but because of the nature of it, it's often classed as a different fabric, because of course you can get linens that are uneven weaves, which is why if you come across, I mean, we can all probably recognise linen when we look at it, but not all linens are evenly woven, so they either have more, you know, more, if you were to stitch on it, there'd be more stitches wide than they would be high. They're not even. So it's always worth, if you've got a piece of linen that maybe you've picked up from somewhere that's not labelled, just to count the fabric, just to make sure it's even. And there's nothing wrong with stitching on uneven linen, but if you were hoping to produce like a, you know, stitch from a chart that as we would normally stitch from in cross stitch, you might find your crosses would be squashed and longer rather than nice even little squares as they would be on an even weave linen. So I just thought I'd mention that just in case it helps anybody. Yeah, so block weaves, as you know, I don't have any of those in my stash. I don't really stitch on them anymore. Absolutely nothing wrong with stitching on them, just my personal choice. I'd much rather stitch on even weaves and linens. But obviously you get Binker, which you get, you know, that's the sort of stuff little kids start out stitching on. That's 6 counts, that's huge. And then you've got Ada, which comes in counts from 8 to 20, and then you've got Hardanger fabric, which is a block weave, and that goes up to 22 counts. So you can actually get some, you know, 22 count is quite a fine count to stitch on over one, so absolutely nothing wrong with stitching on Ada. I just find personally for me, I choose to stitch on linen and even weaves because it opens up a much broader range of fabrics, as I will go on to talk about. Nowadays there is such a wealth of fabric that you can cross stitch on, all sorts of different, without even talking about hand dyes, all sorts of different effects and, you know, prints that are put onto linens and Ada. all different sorts of effects. So there's so much choice out there that if you are a person that likes to use something different, you know, you can really go for it with fabric. There's so many different choices. Of course, with Ada as well, you can get, and the same with even weaves and linen, you can obviously get opalescent fabrics, which have a metallic thread woven through the fabric, which one of my favourite fabrics, obviously. And the other type of fabric for a metallic effect you can get is called silvered Ada, where they sort of spray the sort of sparkles on. I'm not particularly a fan of that. I much rather prefer an opal fabric, an opalescent fabric, but lots of stitchers love it, and so it's just, you know, another effect, something additional you can give to a design by the choice of the fabric you use, but it's entirely up to you what you choose to go with. So that's block weaves, which we all know about. Well, we all know about all of this really, so, but anyway, this is just for people out there that might want to know a bit more about fabric. Then you come to the cotton mix even weaves, or you can get 100% cotton even weaves, which are some of my preferred fabrics. So obviously you, as far as Vigart fabrics are concerned, you've got Lugana. As I've said many times before, different names for fabrics depending on which side of the Atlantic you live on, but they're all the same thing. So in the UK, Lugana fabric is named differently depending on what count it is, whereas in the US and Canada it's just, and probably everywhere else in the world, it is just Lugana and the count. So Lugana is 52% cotton and 48% rayon, so it's a really lovely, great even weave to start on. I have some here, so you can see, I don't know if you can see very well, the holes, I'll put my hand against it, the holes are very evenly spaced, quite clear, even though it's quite a small count of fabric. Holes are quite easy to see, so, and that comes in all sorts of different counts, ranging from 20 count right the way up to 32 count Lugana, except in this country 20 count is called Belana, then you've got 25 count Lugana, 28 count Brittany and 32 count Murano. But it's all the same fabric, so it's you know, it's a lovely, easy, you know, soft fabric to use, and I use it predominantly for my heaven and earth designs really. I just find it's really clear and easy to see the holes, which is important when you're stitching over one really. Yeah, so that's that one. But one of my favourite 28 count fabrics, I would have to say, would be Jobelan. Comes in 28 count and 32 count. I think it comes in lower counts as well, but can't seem to get hold of that in the UK. So I think they just go for the 28 count and 32 counts because they're, you know, the most popular. Jobelan, for all of us, I don't really know how you say it, that's just how I say it. It's very difficult knowing how to pronounce things, but all of us that have stitched on it know what an incredibly soft fabric it is. There's something about it, as soon as you pick it up, you can tell the difference between a piece of Brittany or Lugana and a piece of Jobelan. It's just so soft, and it has a lovely sheen to it, and it's a quite heavy fabric. The holes are easy to see, but as I said before in my Heaven and Earth video, I don't think I couldn't stitch over one on it for any sort of extended period of time. It's just plumper somehow to me. But Jobelan, that's what it looks like. I don't know if you can tell, but it just seems sort of a thicker, a plumper weave really than the Lugana. But the difference with Jobelan is it's 51% cotton and 49% modal or modal. I don't know how you say it. Modal sounds posher. But that's a fantastic, fantastic fabric, Jobelan. If you haven't tried it yet and you're looking for an even weave to stitch on, I would definitely recommend trying out some Jobelan because it's such a lovely fabric. The feel of it is lovely, and it's quite heavy and it drapes really nicely. So, you know, if you were going to make a table runner or something like that, it's just got a really nice shape to the fabric. It really drapes well. So I'd really recommend it for something like that. So those are the main sort of cotton mix even weaves that I use. I have one other favourite fabric that's in this category, but unfortunately it's been discontinued, which I was very sad about when I found out. I don't know why, because it's a great fabric. But it's it was by Zweigart, and it was a 28 count fabric, and it was called Annabelle. And what was different about it is that it was 100% cotton, so it was really soft and really lovely to stitch on. So here's an example. Now you'll see, if it's purple obviously, when I put it up, the beady-eyed amongst you will see that it's got the look of linen, in the sense that as you look at it, it's got sort of slubs. Some of the threads are thicker than others, and so it's got a look of linen about it. So if you pick, now that's a bit better, you can see now when the light shines through it how thick some of those threads in the fabric are. Now a lot of stitchers think, well, you know, why on earth would you want to stitch on something that looks like a linen that isn't? Well, I don't have any really substantial answer for you, other than the fact that I liked it. It's very soft, and obviously linen can be quite expensive, cotton is a lot cheaper, so a cotton even weave that masquerades as linen, you know, might be a better and easier choice for some of us. But I'll just show you what I actually stitched on it, so you've got something to look at other than bits of fabric. This is by Jodrey Designs. This is a chart from Michelle. Michelle designed this chart, and the threads that I used are all hers as well. And I will say that the thread that I chose to use for the dragonfly's wings is one of my absolute favourite threads, favourite coloured hand-dyed threads of all time, which is, for me, saying quite a lot, considering I own hundreds and hundreds of them. So I just thought I'd just show you, I know this is about fabric, but I thought I'd just show you this thread because I love it so much. It's called Peacock Feathers. You can probably tell why I like it. The purple and the blue and the green, it's gorgeous. I really love that. So that's number 30 from Jodrey Designs, Peacock Feathers. If you like the threads, you should go and check out the website. But yeah, so that was stitched on Annabelle. So it gives a sort of that nice sort of look of linen, but it's just a lot softer. Oh, in the middle, the dragonfly's body is stitched in Nevermore, which is again a Jodrey Designs thread. So that's Annabelle. So I'm really, you know, I was a bit sad when they discontinued that, but luckily I scored some, you know, fat quarters of it on eBay when people were selling it, so I have a little supply. But yeah, that's another good choice. Another fabric which is a bit similar in the sense that it's has a linen look about it is Quaker cloth, which is here. Now it's when you look at it, it is different to the Lugana. You can see it does have sort of slightly thicker and thinner threads, but it's actually a mix. It's a cotton linen mix, so you have that sort of look of a little bit of the look of linen, but it's actually really open. The holes in it are really easy to see. So Quaker cloth, or Bantry sometimes it's called, it's got the look of linen but with a lot fewer slubs, so it actually makes a really good choice for somebody who wants to stitch on a sort of linen look fabric. I quite like it, and it's actually what I stitched the drawn thread piece that I showed you in my last video. That was stitched on Quaker cloth, so it's actually really good fabric for that, because it's quite clear and easy to see when you're snipping the threads out of the fabric, because sometimes linen can get, as I'll show in a minute, can get quite difficult to see, and the threads can be quite a lot thicker and thinner by comparison. So yeah, Quaker cloth, if you ever see any of that on your travels, 28 count, that's a really good fabric to work on. Another fabric that I used, again one of these sort of linen look fabrics, is a 25 count fabric. This is when I sort of, at the beginning of my stitching in the last 4 years, I used it. Again, if you look at it, you can see as the light shines through it that you can see that it's made up of thicker and thinner threads. So again, it's got that linen look, but not at the cost or the expense of linen. And that one is a cotton polyester mix. So it's 88% cotton and 12, I can do maths, 12% polyester. So again, it's got a really nice soft feel to it because it's cotton, but it's got that sort of different look about it with the thicker and thinner threads. And I used that to stitch, it was when I was still stitching from the Crossstitcher magazine, and I used it, I'm terrible, I haven't finished it into a cushion, but that's what it was meant for. And I stitched that on it, And so it just has a really nice, you know, for sort of anything, cushions or you know, table runners, things like that, sort of homeware-y, linen-y type look things. It's actually a really great fabric. And that's Colmar, as I said, it's 25 count fabric. But again, another, you know, another fun fabric to try out. I just like trying out new fabrics, seeing what I think of them. But yeah, I really enjoyed stitching on that, and because it was 25 count and that was stitched over 2, it made a really nice change, but you still had a fantastic looking fabric at the end of it. Something, you know, it's got that kind of homey feel about it, that sort of linen look. So those are just a few different fabrics that I've stitched on in the cotton mix and cotton even weave. So I would definitely say, you know, try out different fabrics. I mean, I know not everybody, you know, cares about the fabric they stitch on. They're happy 14 count Ada or 28 count Lugana, and that's all they stitch on, that's fine. But if you're somebody that, you know, likes doing different things like I do, I would definitely recommend, you know, doing a little bit of research on the different types of fabrics and just trying out new ones, because, you know, I really enjoy doing that. So then we come on to linen, which again is a fabric that I love and I've stitched a lot of projects on. I know that some stitchers don't like linen because of the sort of uneven nature of the threads. So here's a random piece of cashel linen. You can see when the light shines through it, you can see the thicker threads showing up there. It's nowhere near, you know, nowhere near as even as Lugana, and sometimes that puts stitchers off. The thing is though, it's not as if when you do your cross stitching on a piece of linen, it's not as if your crosses all, you know, vary in size because of the slubs in the linen, which are those thicker, thinner threads. It still looks, you know, perfectly even. Here's a little stitched example I picked out of something you haven't seen. I'm trying to work through my archives. This is a little freebie from a little stitcher whose charts I bought last month, the Wizard of Oz chart and the Alice in Wonderland chart. This is a little freebie that's on her blog, so I'll link to it in case you're interested in it. But, you know, that's stitched on linen, and it's not as if the slubs in the linen, you know, make the stitching look uneven in any way. Just for those that like to know. This is cashel, 28 count cashel linen. Getting obsessed with how I say things now. In biscuit is the colour, and the threads that I used were hand-dyed fibres silks that I picked from my stash. And the little red shoes, you can see possibly. I found a little, yeah, two little red crystals in my stash, so I had to put those on. Although I was slightly tempted to stitch them in silver, but I guess it all depends whether you prefer books or movies. Yeah, so that's linen. So I wouldn't say, don't be I mean, if you hate stitching on linen, you know, absolutely fair enough. But if you've not stitched on linen and you've heard people talk about all the uneven nature of it, I would say give it a go, because it's not as if your cross stitch is going to look way off. I like stitching on linen. I like the look and feel that it gives a piece. Obviously I wouldn't necessarily stitch every single of the pieces that I stitch on linen. Sometimes it's all down to the project, how the project looks and feels as to what fabric I choose to stitch. So it's not like I'll say, oh, I always use linen, because I don't. But for certain projects I think it really adds something to the piece, having that sort of feel about it. So obviously this is a piece of Zweigart linen, it's cashel linen. All the linens that Zweigart make will be named according to their count. So you've got 20 count Cork linen, 25 count Dublin linen, 28 count Cashel linen, 32 count Belfast linen, 36 count Edinburgh linen, 40 count Newcastle linen, and 50 count Kingston linen. So if somebody says, oh, I'm stitching this on Belfast linen, you know straight away that it's on 32 count. Now the other type of linen that you can use, as I said at the start, is Permin or Witch Out linen, which is fine. I've stitched on it. Here's an example. I would say, looking at the two fabrics, that the Permin linen is much stiffer, but actually the holes in the fabric are clearer. So it's still got that sort of, you can see the slubs in the fabric straight away when the light shines through it. But the holes, you know, because of the stiff nature of it, the holes are actually a bit easier to see. So that's this one, although the fabric is stiffer in itself. So this design is by the Drawn Thread. It's called the Cloister Garden. Can't remember what I stitched, what threads I used. I think I just used a random mix of ones from my stash. Probably feels like silk threads from my stash. But yeah, so that's that one. I know I'm supposed to be talking about fabric, but you might want to see what I've actually stitched on it, just as an example. So yeah, that's that one. Lots of all sorts of different stitches in that one for a tiny design. Queen stitches. What are those stitches called? I want to say they're called spider rose stitches. I have a feeling I've mixed up two stitches in my head there, but I'm sure you'll forgive me for that. Yeah, so that's, comparing the feel of the two. Zweigart linens are much softer, Permin linens are stiffer, but then some people prefer stitching on a stiffer fabric, so again, absolutely all down to personal choice. My preference now when it comes to linen, actually, it does depend on the design that I'm stitching, but I much prefer now stitching on 32 count and 36 count linens. 28 count cachal's fine. Now I think I will probably only stitch on 28 count linen for chatelaines. If I choose to stitch a chatelaine that's got a particular huge number of beads on, I would use a 28 count fabric, and if linen was something that I thought would add to the design, then I would use 28 count. But on the whole, I would definitely say I'm moving much more towards 32 and 36 count fabrics. I don't think I can see myself stitching on 40 count or 50 count, but you never know. So yeah, those are my thoughts on linen. The other thing is, with Zweigart fabrics, you can get, without going into hand dyes, they do produce fabrics that are have different sort of effects on them. Again, with linens, you can get your opal fabrics, and I've got a few of those in my stash, hand dyed ones. But I had a piece of cashel, it was 28 count vintage green linen in my stash that I'd got for a ridiculous bargain on eBay, which is where I get a lot of my fabric from. And I chose to use it to stitch a design you've probably all seen a million times, and that's, I was going to say Mirabilia, no, Lavender and Lace Celtic Spring, and I chose to stitch her on that vintage green cashel because it's, as I say, it's not hand dyed, it's like a colour wash they put on it, but it just gives a really nice mottled feel, just something a bit different. So that's always another option, because not everybody likes stitching on hand dyed fabrics, but they want something a little bit extra perhaps on their fabric. Now I don't know if this effect will come out very well on this video, but there is Celtic Spring. I just didn't want to stitch, I didn't want to stitch on a hand dyed because there was quite a lot sort of colours going on really, but I just wanted something a bit different for the background, so it's probably not coming out very well at all. I don't know if you can sort of see. You can see as the light shines through it, sort of darker and lighter patches, but it's just a very light sort of mottle, nothing too strong at all. And I just thought, it looked nice. Now you can sort of see it a little bit, it just looked nice. Just something a bit different to stitch her on. So that's always another idea, if you want something a little bit different, but you perhaps don't want to go, because we all know hand-dyed fabrics can be quite expensive. So just look at the different effects that Zweigart offer on their fabrics. That might be something that you fancy having a look at. So those are just briefly, she says, after about half an hour probably, a look at all the different types of fabric. So maybe that's given you some ideas, different fabrics to look out for. As I said, one of my other addictions is eBay. The majority of my fabric stash is made up of fabrics that I've scored for really cheap prices on eBay. Once you get to know the type of fabrics that you like stitching on, you're always going to want 32 count or 28 count or 16 count, whatever. You can sort of stock up on fabrics at a really cheap price, and that's what I like to do. So now we get on to the topic of hand-dyed fabrics. As you know, I like stitching on hand-dyed fabrics. There are all sorts of different hand-dyed fabric dyers. That does make sense. In the UK, I think we're particularly fortunate because sometimes I do feel that us UK stitchers miss out on all these, you know, fantastic bargains you people, lovely stitchers, have in America and Canada with your, you know, Michael's coupons and getting your skeins of DMC for 10 cents or something ridiculous. Not that I'm jealous or anything, but we do have some, I love you all really, but I do have, we do have in the UK some really fantastic fabric dyers. So we've got Pole Stitches, Crafty Kitten, Sparklies, and obviously, as you know, I like Jojo Designs hand-dyed fabrics, and now also I've become a big fan of Chromatic Alchemy's hand-dyed fabrics. And then of course you've got the other fabric dyers, you know, in the States and in Australia. So you've got Picture This Plus, Silk Weavers, hand-dyed fabrics by Stephanie, Sassy's Fabric, Under the Sea Fabrics, and then in Australia you've got Stitches and Spice and Colour Cascade Fabrics. So I'll make sure I put links to all of those just in case any of those are new to you, because I love looking at hand-dyed fabrics, as you probably know by now. But one point to note about hand-dyed fabrics, if you are sort of new to them and you're choosing your hand-dyed fabric, maybe it's for the Mirabilia stitch along, you've thought, yes, I'm going to use a hand-dyed fabric for the first time. One thing to bear in mind, I don't know if I've said this before, I probably have, is that different fabrics will take the dye differently. So for example, linens always dye darker than Luganas, and opal Luganas dye lighter still than just ordinary Lugana. So it's always worth noting when you're looking at hand-dyed fabrics and you're looking at the picture that the seller has, you know, put up there, it's always worth seeing what fabric that is a picture of, because it'll give you an indication of how light or dark the dye will take onto the fabric. So sometimes when I'm picking a hand-dyed fabric, like I did for red, the Mirabilia I'm going to be stitching in the stitch along, I was more concerned about how the dye would take to the fabric, and that really helped me to choose the type of fabric I wanted to stitch on, because I know that I'm fine stitching on Jobelan or linen or Lugana. It didn't make any difference to me. I knew I wanted her to be stitched on 32 count, but the actual type of fabric very much depended on the colour of the fabric, you know, the colour fabric that I wanted her to be stitched on, and I wanted sort of a darker effect, so that's why I chose to stitch her on linen, because I wanted the dye to take a bit darker to the fabric. So that's always something worth bearing in mind when you're looking at hand-dyed fabrics. Now, as I rifled through my archives to show you some stitched examples, I came across well, two hand-dyed fabrics that I've stitched on that I absolutely love, one more than the other. The reason why will become obvious to you, I'm sure. But I know I've seen in the comments when people have been talking about the Mirabilia stitch along, that they were saying that they haven't stitched on linen. It'll be their first time stitching on linen, and I didn't know if that meant even weave in general or just linen, because of course you can stitch your Mirabilia on anything, but if you're looking at stitching on even weave, you can either choose a cotton based even weave, as I've talked about, or you can choose to stitch on actual linen, 100% linen, 100% flax, which is what linen is. So I just wanted to say, if that was a problem for anybody, that of course you can stitch, you know, you can stitch your Mirabilia on Jobelan or Lugana, any type of fabric. And one of my favourite fabrics to stitch on is hand-dyed Jobelan fabric, so you can still have a beautiful hand-dyed fabric if that's what you want for your Mirabilia, but you don't necessarily have to stitch it on linen. So this isn't a Mirabilia, but you know, similar style design. This is Joan Elliott, a brilliant, fabulous designer. I have several of hers in my stash to do, and it's something that I really want to get around doing, so I'm going to really have to think about my stitching plans for 2015 to see what I can shoehorn in there, but I'm sure that'll be a topic for another video. But this is Medieval Lady. It first appeared as a series of Joan Elliott's historical ladies, and this is the first in the series. I've got the other three to stitch, and also she's got Fairy Tale Princesses, of which there are 3 in that series, and I desperately want to stitch them as well, for obvious reasons. It fits in with the fairy tale and the dress obsession that I seem to have when it comes to stitching. But this is her. Now this fabric is gorgeous. It's Jobelan, 28 count, and it's by Pole Stitches, and it's called Avalon. And it was actually the recommended fabric that the magazine said to stitch it on, but because I absolutely adored the fabric, I went with it for a change rather than picking my own. But it's such a beautiful fabric to stitch on because the Jobelan is just so soft. So for any of you that think you should stitch your mirabilias on linen, you don't have to. You can choose any even weave you want to, really. It's all about the look of the thing. It's what looks best for you. But I just thought I'd show her because I just love the fabric. I should get some more pieces of this, really. And as far as this stitch piece goes, I think I stitched it as per the chart, just for a change. I did actually use the Krennic. Sometimes I substitute the Krennic for Petite Treasure braid, but I just thought I'd do what I was told for once and go with that. The only change I made is I found a little crystal in my stash to put on her necklace. But anyway, this is supposed to be about fabric, so here's the fabric. So definitely pole stitches, fantastic fabric dyer. There's just so many colours out there. I know when I was sort of deciding what fabric to use for my mirabilia, I spent ages on the Fabric Viewer website, just looking at all the different, you know, so much choice out there. But I think I've narrowed it down, so we should be okay. Although I'll probably change my mind. But one of my most favourite pieces of fabric, hand-dyed fabric that I've ever used, is from Kate at Sparkly's. I love this piece of fabric. The name of the fabric is Purveyors Spludge, which is a great name. And this is a piece of 28 count opal cashel linen. Oh, helps if I put it up the right way around. And I just absolutely love this fabric. It's not showing up very well at all, but it's just beautiful, and I just love the sparkles through it. But the design that I've stitched on it is called The Great Escape, and it's another one of the stitch alongs I showed in my last video, The Tree of Stitches by Abby Gurdon. This one was another stitch along done as part of the Yahoo Stitch Specialists group, and I love stitching it. I loved all the different stitches in it. There are so many stitches. I don't think in this piece actually there is a single cross stitch, not at all. So there's all sorts of different stitches in there. You'll see on the owl's feathers there's sorbello stitch, oyster stitch, buttonhole stitch, queen stitch. Can't remember for the life of me what that stitch is that his wings are. It looks like knit stitch actually, but I don't know. The signpost pole, that's Van Dyke stitch, I think. And then all the little flowers, different stitches. I really need to get this piece framed at some point because I do love it. And the little mice and the beetles, got octagon road stitches there. The little lazy daisies, they weren't too bad to stitch because I stitched them in using wildflowers thread, so I didn't have to worry about having two strands to sit right on the fabric for the lazy daisy stitches. But yeah, so fabric is what we're supposed to be looking at. But the threads that I used a whole different array of threads. So there's I think most of the owl, well all the owl is stitched in silk, Gloriana silks and a dinky dye silk, and then there's metallics in there, there's beads in there, dinky dye silks, wildflowers, Karen wildflowers thread, yeah, all sorts of things in that one. And of course the little purple metallic stars, little islets, and there's little butterflies in the moon. But yeah, that I would, if I had to pick one of my favourite pieces of hand-dyed fabric, it would be that Purveyors Spludge by Sparkly's. Really beautiful. So there's my little thoughts on fabric. Oh, I do have one more design to show you that I just thought I'd shoehorn in. It is stitched on, I don't know if it's hand-dyed, but it's stitched on linen with with like a sort of sky effect. It's blue. But I thought I'd just show it to you anyway because it's fun. Just in case anybody out there wanted to stitch it. Here it is, a little Darth, looking cute with his oh, I didn't do it sparkly. I was thinking about doing his lightsaber sparkly, but I didn't in the end. But I did add a little bit of sparkle to his buttons. Not that you can tell, but they're done in metallic thread, and the whole border is done in Petite Treasure braid, metallic thread. But yeah, come to the dark side. We have cookies. I know that when I put this up on my Flickr account, everybody was asking me, oh, where did you get that, where did you get that? But it's a completely free design, so I'll link to it just in case any of you want to have a look at it. And it is stitched on linen, but it's sort of got a, you know, blue bluey, very light blue effect going through the fabric. So yeah, I just thought I'd show you that one just for fun, as if I haven't talked enough. Now we get to my fabric stash, which isn't very exciting. Well, I don't know, it might be exciting to you. But basically, all my fabric is in this box. When it comes to fabric, as I've said, I do get a lot of fabric from eBay, and what I tend to do is buy up fat quarters and meters, full meters of fabric of what I consider to be the fabrics that I use the most. So I always like to make sure that I have those fabrics in stock, so to speak, so that at any point I could start anything, which I know probably sounds horrifying to some of you, but I'm not a serial starter, so I'm not tempted to start a zillion things at once. I can really only cope with about having 5 whips at a time, so for me it's no great temptation to have, you know, that much fabric on hand really. So I always like to make sure I've got Drobelan in stock, Belfast 32 count Belfast linen, 36 count Edinburgh linen, and I do have quite a bit of Cashel linen as well. So in my box, let's see what I have. I also always like to make sure I've got 25 count Lugana as well, but I seem to have run out of that, which probably explains why I haven't done much hardanger lately. Yeah, so basically in my fabric stash, you know, I've got a metre of 32 count Belfast, I've got a metre of 28 count Brittany, I've got a metre of 32 count white Drobelan. I like to keep all pale, you know, neutral fabric so that I can start anything. As I've said before, when it comes to special projects, for example the Mirabilia Red, then I will specifically choose and buy a fabric for that project. It won't necessarily be one I have in stock. I sound like a shop. But I know there are, you know, plenty of stitchers out there who perhaps are in Fabric of the Month clubs with hand-dyed fabric companies. I mean, technically I am, I suppose, but I don't have a huge stash of hand-dyed fabrics. I prefer to choose the fabric when I get the project, rather than having a massive stash of hand-dyed fabrics that I may or may not use. That's my methodology. I'm more about the threads than I am the fabric. A metre of 36 count Edinburgh, that was a complete bargain I got on eBay. I paid £15 for a metre of Zweigart Edinburgh linen, which is 75% off the retail price, because to buy a metre of linen is about 45–50 quid, so I was very pleased when I discovered that on eBay. And then I've got a metre of a random 28 count, which is actually the fabric I'm using for mini Watching It Fly. I don't know what it is, it's a mystery fabric really, I can't quite work it out, but it's brilliant for what I want it for, so that was another bargain that I found. Then I've got fat quarters of linen, 28 count linen. I've got several, you know, all again neutral tones that can be used for anything. This is a piece of, oh, it comes up better on there. This again is the vintage linen that I was talking about that Zweigart do, 28 count Cashel, but this is the white. I stitched these Celtic Spring on the green version, but you can see that it's, you know, from that sort of angle, it's sort of very slightly mottled, just produces a different, you know, a different effect on the fabric. And then I always like to have sort of a natural brown linens, white linens, and there's a tiny little bit of blue, which is the blue that I'm stitching Hortus Viridarium on. It actually shows up better on there. It never shows up blue on the pictures that I take of it, but it looks better there. Yeah, so just, you know, lots of fat quarters of linen. So, you know, it's quite, my fabric stash, I love it, but it's quite boring, because I just choose to stock up on plain fabrics that I know I'll get the most use out of. And that's what I do. So I very rarely pay for plain, you know, plain coloured fabrics. I very rarely pay full price. So normally I pay about £4 for a fat quarter, whereas if I bought it from so and so, it's normally about £11 to £12 for a fat quarter. So that's where I like to make my savings on my fabric. Oh, I've got a little piece I'd forgotten about of Lugana there, chocolate coloured. And then I just keep sort of little scrappy pieces I don't like to throw anything away really. If I think I can use it somewhere, I'll keep it. So I've got sort of little small offcuts of linen in there, all different colours and counts. Again, some more linen there. It's quite a bit of fabric really, I suppose, I don't know. Having seen some people's fabric stash, this is puny and tiny by comparison. And these are some sort of offcuts of Jobberland, so they're all quite usable pieces. You know, we're not talking tiny ornament size cuts necessarily, but as the projects I tend to do now normally require, you know, a fat quarter or something, then that's what I use. The remainder of my fabric stash are my little pieces of hand-dyed fabrics. So some of them you've seen already. I don't know, do you want to see them? I don't have very much hand-dyed fabric. So those are the 4 you've already seen from Chromatic Alchemy, which I had in my update video. And then I have, I've got some silk weaver pieces. So these are some pieces of silk weaver Lugana. As you can tell, you know, purpley, blue, you know. These are all sort of 9x12 little cuts that I can use for, you know, various different things. It's a nice blue one. I do have ideas on what to stitch for most of these, just never actually get round to doing it. Any more silk weavers pieces? And then I've got some little bits of sugar maple fabric, which I think they've sort of gone out of business a bit now. I don't think they're around anymore, but you know, some nice different fabrics there. Yeah, that's another piece of nice sort of green hand-dyed piece. I've got some little pole stitches pieces by the look of it. Yeah, some more little small cups of, you know, purple again. Don't worry, my fabric mountain won't overtake me, there's not much left. Oh, a piece of Crafty Kitten again. This one is cashao linen. Opal fabric, what's it called? Sunlit Smoke. That's quite nice. The other thing, I think I mentioned it before with hand-dyed fabrics when I was talking about chatelaines, is to remember that with hand-dyed fabrics, shrinkage can occur. So a 28 count fabric can be more of a 30 count fabric, 32 count fabric can be more of a 34 count fabric. So that's always something to bear in mind as well. So I don't mind stitching on cashao, you know, straight up cashao linen, but when you stitch on hand-dyed linen, it's a bit smaller. And the rest of my fabrics are my Jodery Designs fabrics. Now you've already seen this month's limited edition, the lovely purple Out of Orbit opal, but this one is lovely. I was so pleased. This one was a limited edition fabric that Michelle did, but everybody loved it so much that they kind of petitioned her to make it part of her regular range. Now I don't think it will necessarily show up very well on the camera, but it's called Speckled Eggs and it is beautiful, and I'm thinking it's an opal. Well, it does show up. It just looks a lot more, when the light shines through it you can see the shapes of the different colours, but actually on the actual fabric when you look at it it's much more muted. But it's again an opal, see the sparkle, but I was thinking it may do very well for one of my Joan Elliott Fairy Tale Princesses, Cinderella, and there was another design I was looking at stitching on it as well. But thankfully, although it started off life as a special limited edition, it is no longer, so it means that if I do decide to stitch several things on it I don't have to choose because I can always buy some more from Michelle. So yeah, that's been one of my favourite Jodery Designs fabrics that I've received in my monthly club. Speckled Eggs, as I said, that one's called. I might bother packing it up. This is a piece of 28 count linen from Jodery Designs. If I can get into it, would help. I always choose, if I'm going to have fabric, hand-dyed fabric in my stash, usually it has to contain some sort of purple in it because I love purple so much that I will stitch on it. Or alternatively I may just look at the fabric and never want to stitch on it and just frame it, just the fabric itself. That's a piece of, it's coming up a bit bluer actually, but it's more of a, those bits that look blue are actually more lilac. But as the light shines through it, it's hard to see. That's a bit better if I show it to you like that. Yep, so that's a little 18 by 13 cut of Purplinky, the colour of that is. And this one is May limited edition from Dorothy Designs, which we obviously won't be able to buy anymore. But again, it's just beautiful colours. And then again, it's an opal fabric. I'm not sure what I'm going to stitch that one. What I'm going to stitch on that one, but you know, I just love it really. So, oh, one more, just in case you're paying attention. Oh, this is 28 count Jaslyn, which is a different fabric. I think Michelle at the time, this was March's limited edition. At the time, was having a problem getting hold of, had a gap in supply of her Brittany, but she had Jaslyn, so I said, oh yeah, Jaslyn's fine. That's another Zweigart fabric. I can't remember off the top of my head what makes it different now. It's a slightly different composition. Somewhere in my brain, it's telling me that this is a bit sort of similar to Jobberland, so it might have been Zweigart's kind of version of that. I can't remember, but it feels slightly softer than ordinary Lugana. So this one's called Irish Brilliance, which makes sense when you consider it's orange and green. And that was, as I say, March's limited edition, so that would have been because of St Patrick's Day, obviously. Yeah, so those are all my fabrics. So I don't know if that's a lot of fabric. I don't think it is really. I don't think you can ever have too much fabric. Oh, no, it's not. There's some more. This little packet is little hand-dyed offcuts. One thing I won't show you them all. One thing I will say is sometimes it is difficult to try and figure out what a piece of hand-dyed fabric looks like just by looking at a computer monitor. But Sparkleys is one of the very few fabric companies that Kate, she will send out little sample pieces so you can actually see what the fabric looks like in real life. I think they're only like £1 a piece. But, you know, if you're considering spending, I mean, I did this because I was, not all of these, but some of these were under consideration for a chatelaine I wanted to do, Sleeping Beauty's Castle. I wanted to do it on hand-dyed fabric. And obviously, as you can appreciate, a piece of hand-dyed fabric for a chatelaine is quite expensive. So it's actually worth paying the £1 for several little samples instead of wasting, you know, 50, 60, possibly pounds on a piece of hand-dyed fabric that doesn't suit the pattern you want it for. So that is something to consider that I thought I would just mention, that Kate at Sparkleys does the little sample pieces. You won't necessarily know what count the fabric is, but it will stipulate the difference, for example, between linen and Lugana, because as I said, they do take the dye differently. So that is, you know, that's why I think it's fantastic that Kate offers that, because not all fabric dyes do. To be honest, not that I would mind if a piece of fabric turned up and it wasn't quite what I'd anticipated, but when you're buying a massive piece for a chatelaine, I would find that a bit annoying if I didn't like the fabric when it came. So look, I love that one. This Dark Goddess. I must find something to stitch on that. I would love to have a piece of a fat quarter of that fabric in my stash. But yeah, so that's something to consider. And there's a few other in there. Is also fabric from a Folksy grab bag, because quite a few, well, the majority of the fabric dyes in the UK and elsewhere have offcuts and random pieces of fabric, and they put them in grab bags. And Folksy quite often, Joe at Folksy on our Facebook group, will offer, you know, grab bags at special prices. And grab bags don't necessarily have to be tiny pieces of fabric. She quite often will do grab bags of fat quarters at a really insane price. So that's always something, if you're a bit of a hand-dyed fabric fanatic, it's always good to check out if the companies have Facebook groups, Facebook pages, because quite often they'll have like special offers on there. I'm a real sucker for anybody that has a Facebook sale. So I think every month, Dawn at Crafty Kitten, she'll put up, you know, random pieces that she's got, that she's perhaps dyed, and then the person decided they didn't want it or whatever, and she puts those pieces up on Facebook, as well as perhaps seconds where there might be a little dye spot here and there. so they're a little bit cheaper, but to be honest, you can, sometimes they're right at the very edge of the fabric, and even if they're in the middle, you're probably going to stitch over it anyway. But yeah, so I definitely recommend, if you want to build up your hand-dyed fabric stash a bit, or if it's something you think you want to get into, then yeah, I would definitely recommend checking out all the dyers' Facebook groups and Facebook pages. So, it's probably my longest video of all time, but I'm sure no doubt it won't be the longest ever. I am planning on doing a video, some more stash videos. I will do a separate video on my silk thread stash and a separate video on my cotton thread stash. I could probably do a video on my chart stash. I don't know if anybody's interested in seeing what I've got. And then I would like to show, do another video on the projects that I've kitted up. And I thought when I do that video, I think Jan Thread Garden asked me about how I go about doing thread conversions and things like that, because I quite often like to use silks instead of cotton, or use something completely different, different threads to what's actually called for on the chart. So I thought I would talk about thread conversions in that, because it kind of fits in with the way I kit up my projects. And yeah, go from there really. I know some people have also asked me to show a bit more detail about my Lowry stand, which I will do, and also how I grid my fabric with thread. So I'll probably do those two things in my update video at the end of the month, when I update you on all my whips. So now I've said that, I must remember to do it, so look out for those little things then. Again, if you've got any questions on anything I've talked about today, please let me know. I'd love to know the fabrics, perhaps your favourite hand-dyed fabric of all time, or the fabrics you like to use, your favourite fabrics, anything fabric related. Please feel free to leave a comment. Let me know, because I like to find new things. In fact, there's a new fabric that I'm hoping to try out soon. You may remember in my wish list video, I chose a scarlet letter sampler called a flame stitch sampler. And I've been doing a bit of research, and a fabric called Flober, which sounds horrible, but it is Vigot based fabric, 35 count. I think that might be a fabric that I choose for that design. It's a completely new to me fabric, but it appealed to me because it was, I think it's 70% viscose and 30% linen, but it hasn't got the slub, so it's fine. A fine fabric to stitch on, but without the slubs. So I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. So there's always something, you know, new to learn. I think you can't ever know anything there ever is to know. I certainly don't. I'm always learning new things, you know, but that's because I'm interested in it. Not everybody cares what fabric they use, but I do. I quite like fabric, but not as much as threads. But anyway, if you've got to the end of this mammoth video, thank you. I hope it's, you know, if you're new to stitching, I hope it's given you an insight into the whole range of fabrics that you can use. And maybe if you've been stitching for years, there's been a fabric that I've mentioned that you thought, oh, I like the sound of that, I'd like to use it. So I hope it's been useful and interesting. And finally, I've shown you a little bit of my stash, so that seems fair. So thank you for watching. Sorry again for the long video. I think it's probably coming up to an hour. I must make the longest stitching videos on YouTube, it's ridiculous. But anyway, thank you to all my subscribers and for the people that regularly watch my videos, and also a big thank you to all of you that regularly comment. I really appreciate all your comments, and I always try and reply, and I just love to hear about what you're stitching, and you know, the materials and things that you use, and I love watching all your videos, so thank you for taking the time to do all of that. I really appreciate it. So that's this video, so all that's left for me to say is thanks for watching and happy stitching.